The power had been out for hours. Karim sat in his small, dimly lit workshop in Nairobi, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the wooden walls. He ran a hand through his short, coiled hair, his mind racing. The biodigester prototype he had spent months designing lay in pieces on the table, its future hanging by a thread. He had built this project from scratch, a system that could turn organic waste into clean energy for rural households. It was supposed to be his breakthrough. The answer to the choking fumes of charcoal and kerosene that filled his mother's house growing up. The solution to the energy crisis plaguing countless families in Kenya. But the banks didn't care about solutions. They cared about collateral. "Your business plan is solid," the loan officer had said, her polished nails tapping against the papers on her desk. "But without substantial assets, we can't approve your request." A polite way of saying, "You're not rich enough to deserve funding." That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, every investor, every grant committee had given him the same answer: no. He exhaled slowly, staring at the prototype. Without capital, he couldn't build more units. Without more units, he had nothing to sell. And without sales, his dream of a cleaner, more sustainable Africa was slipping through his fingers. Maybe he had been foolish. Maybe the system wasn't designed for people like him. The power came back with a dull hum, and his dusty laptop screen flickered to life. A message notification popped up from his childhood friend, Ayan. Karim frowned. He had heard of Bitcoin in passing, mostly in the same breath as scams and speculation. But decentralized finance? That was new. Ayan's next message came with a link. "Forget banks. This is how people like us get funded now." Karim clicked. He had nothing left to lose. Across the world, in the glass skyscrapers of New York and London, money moved in ways that felt like magic. Governments printed billions at will, interest rates were adjusted like dials on a machine, and those who controlled the system lived above the chaos. But for people like Karim, the weight of this centralization was suffocating. In Africa, nearly 60% of people are unbanked, locked out of the formal economy. In Latin America, small businesses paid interest rates exceeding 30%, while Western corporations borrowed at nearly zero. Sustainability projects, even worse. Investors wanted fast profits, not slow-growing impact ventures. A rainforest restoration project might take decades to show financial returns. Meanwhile, an oil company could double their money in a year. The system wasn't broken, it was built this way. Karim didn't realize it yet, but the link Ayan had sent him was more than just an alternative funding method. It was an entirely new way of thinking about money. Karim had never trusted banks, but he had trusted numbers. So, when he found himself deep in the rabbit hole of DeFi, reading white papers and watching tutorials until his eyes burned, it wasn't the hype that caught his attention. It was the math. Unlike banks, where a handful of executives controlled the rules, DeFi was built on blockchain, a transparent ledger where every transaction was public. No hidden fees, no discriminatory loan officers, just code. And the most important part, smart contracts. Programs that could automatically distribute loans, verify payments, and execute agreements, all without a single human involved. One DeFi platform in particular stood out: Resource Finance, a protocol that allowed businesses to borrow without collateral, using their future sales as credit. It sounded impossible, until Karim saw the testimonials. A woman in Brazil had funded her entire solar panel business this way. A farmer in India had used it to expand his organic farm. This wasn't charity, this was a system that believed in people like him. For the first time in weeks, Karim felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Applying for a loan through DeFi wasn't like walking into a bank. There was no suit-wearing official to impress, no paperwork to prove his worth. All he needed was a crypto wallet and a project proposal uploaded to the platform. Within hours, investors from around the world, regular people, not banks, had started funding him. Some contributed $10, others $500, but together they were raising the capital he needed. When the final transaction came through, Karim stared at his screen in disbelief. $15,000, enough to produce his first batch of biodigesters, enough to change everything. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He had spent months begging for this money in banks, and now, in less than 24 hours, strangers had trusted him with it. No middlemen, no corruption, no exploitation. Decentralization wasn't just a financial tool, it was a revolution. Karim wasn't the only one discovering DeFi's power. Across the world, a new movement was growing: regenerative finance, or ReFi. Unlike traditional finance, which rewarded extraction, ReFi was built to restore. One of the biggest success stories was Terra, a startup using blockchain to protect the Amazon. Instead of relying on governments, they issued carbon tokens, where each token represented a plot of rainforest. Investors could buy these tokens, funding conservation directly. If someone tried to deforest that land, the blockchain would show exactly who was responsible. For the first time, nature had financial value, not just for destruction, but for preservation. This wasn't theory, this was happening, and it was only the beginning. If ReFi was about funding sustainability, DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, were about governing it. In Senegal, a village had been living in darkness, unable to afford grid electricity. Instead of waiting for the government, they formed a DAO, a community-run fund where everyone had voting power. Through DeFi, they raised enough to build a solar microgrid, owned and managed collectively. No politicians, no corruption, just people taking back control. The lesson was clear. If the system won't fix itself, build a new one. Governments weren't blind to this shift. DeFi threatened the very foundations of their control. Crackdowns had begun, regulations were tightening, but the people behind this movement weren't backing down. Because now they had proof. Decentralization wasn't just an idea, it was working. Karim's biodigesters were now in 300 homes. Energy bills had dropped, carbon footprints had shrunk, and it had all started with a single DeFi transaction. The old system had failed him. So he built a new one, and so can we.